Doug Weiss built his reputation as a trusted voice of faith and guidance, but now his ministry stands at the edge of collapse. After explosive revelations tied to the Daystar TV scandal, questions are swirling. Can his legacy survive, or has the truth finally caught up with him? Once praised for his leadership, he's now facing scrutiny that could end everything he's worked for. The future of Doug Weiss's ministry may never look the same again. Doug Weiss did not begin his journey in the spotlight. For years, he built himself slowly, presenting the image of a man with both professional training and personal conviction. He leaned on the authority of his counseling credentials and presented himself as someone who could speak honestly about the hardest parts of human life: sex addiction, broken marriages, betrayal, and shame. These were topics most pastors avoided, but Doug leaned into them. That courage to address what others wouldn't gave him traction. In church communities hungry for answers, he quickly stood out. Daystar TV became the stage that turned him from a counselor into a household name. The network, founded by Marcus and Joni Lamb, was already well known for its prosperity gospel tone and its wide reach, broadcasting into millions of homes across the world. When Doug stepped onto that platform, his voice carried farther than it ever had before. He wasn't just sitting across from clients in private offices anymore. He was speaking into living rooms, directly to husbands, wives, and families who felt broken. On screen, he became the expert who could diagnose the pain and offer a pathway to healing. Over time, his appearances became regular. Viewers recognized his name and face, and the way he spoke gave the impression of authority and empathy combined. He positioned himself as someone who not only understood the human heart, but could also bring spiritual truth into it. This blending of psychology and faith is what made him unique. He wasn't just another TV pastor, and he wasn't just another counselor. He was both, and that gave him influence in a space where many Christians felt they had nowhere else to turn. Books and seminars expanded that influence even further. He wrote guides on marriage, sexual purity, and relational restoration, packaging his insights into material that churches and small groups could use. His name started to circulate among church leaders, marriage ministries, and conferences. Soon, he wasn't only a guest on television, he was a brand. Couples signed up for his intensives, believing that his programs could rescue their marriages. People quoted his books, pastors recommended his work, and the image of Doug Weiss as a trusted authority became more and more ingrained in evangelical culture. At the heart of his rise was the promise of hope. He presented himself as proof that no struggle was too dark, no addiction too binding, and no relationship too broken for redemption. He didn't just talk about healing in theory. He described it as something he had seen in practice, something he had helped countless people achieve. For many Christians, that message was irresistible. They were used to sermons about faith and sin, but rarely did anyone give them practical tools for rebuilding trust after betrayal or finding freedom after years of secrecy. Doug filled that gap, and people followed him because of it. As the 2000s unfolded, his reach widened. Daystar gave him a global audience, his books gave him credibility, and his seminars gave him a personal connection to those desperate for change. To many, he was more than a counselor. He was a rescuer, someone who wasn't afraid to step into the mess of human weakness and offer a way out. That reputation became the foundation of his ministry. It was polished, respected, and for a time, untouchable. Looking back, it's clear why he rose so fast. He had the right stage, the right message, and the right timing. In an age when the church was beginning to wrestle more openly with addiction and moral failure, Doug Weiss offered a voice that sounded like authority wrapped in compassion. He became a trusted figure in Christian homes, a name people reached for when they felt out of answers. That trust would become the currency of his success, and eventually, the most fragile part of his story. The story of Doug Weiss's fall didn't come all at once. Like most scandals, it unfolded slowly, piece by piece, until the picture could no longer be ignored. For years, Weiss had built a reputation as a healer, a counselor, a man who gave practical advice to Christians struggling with addiction, infidelity, and broken marriages. He carried himself as someone who understood human weakness and could guide people back to strength. But behind that polished image, troubling stories began to surface. Stories that painted a very different picture of the man so many had trusted. The first cracks came in whispers. Former participants in his counseling intensives began speaking about their experiences, and what they described didn't sound like the safe, supportive environment that had been advertised. Some said Weiss would administer surprise polygraph tests, forcing participants into moments of deep fear and humiliation without warning. Others claimed that he made emotional demands that crossed boundaries, asking them to bare their souls in ways that felt manipulative rather than therapeutic. These were not isolated complaints. They began appearing across online forums, Christian blogs, and survivor spaces. Again and again, the same words came up: controlling, unsettling, slick, and even creepy. It wasn't long before those private accounts started to spill into the public square. Online communities, especially places where people discussed their experiences with Christian leaders, lit up with stories about Weiss. The image of the calm, wise counselor on television didn't match what some women said they had lived through in his program. The gap between the stage persona and the personal behavior grew wider, and people started asking the hardest question: was Doug Weiss really who he claimed to be? At the same time, Daystar, the platform that had elevated Weiss to fame, was itself unraveling in scandal. Allegations of financial misuse, spiritual intimidation, and even cover-ups of abuse within the Lamb family were exploding into public view. Weiss's name surfaced in connection to some of these stories, including reports that funds from the network may have been used for his wedding and honeymoon with Joni Lamb. That overlap made it impossible to separate his personal ministry from the broader crisis at Daystar. Suddenly, Doug wasn't just a counselor accused of questionable practices. He was part of a bigger story of corruption and exploitation tied to one of the most influential Christian networks in the world. The scandal hit fast and hard. Ministries that had once aired their shows on Daystar began pulling out. High-profile leaders like Joyce Meyer, Jesse Duplantis, and Lance Wallnau distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with the controversy. For Weiss, this was devastating. His credibility had been rooted in the trust of the Christian community, and that trust was evaporating. Where once his name had been linked with hope and healing, now it was linked with manipulation, misconduct, and dishonesty. But what made the scandal even heavier was the way people responded. In blog posts, comment sections, and social media threads, betrayed Christians expressed their heartbreak. One commenter put it simply: wolves in sheep's clothing. Avoid. Others said they felt used, deceived, or spiritually violated. Some pointed to their own experiences of attending his events and feeling coerced or shamed in ways that did not reflect the love and compassion of the gospel he claimed to represent. These weren't critics from outside the faith. They were insiders, believers who had once looked to him for help. Their voices carried weight, and their anger spread fast. Meanwhile, former insiders at Daystar began revealing more about the culture behind the scenes. They described an environment where raising questions led to demotions, firings, or being spiritually silenced. Jonathan and Susie Lamb themselves spoke about being pushed out after raising objections. There were recordings of leaders making sweeping claims that equated loyalty to Daystar with loyalty to God. For many watching from the outside, it confirmed their worst fears, that power had been abused, voices had been crushed, and money meant for ministry had been misused. And Doug Weiss, far from being separate, was right in the middle of it. The combination of personal allegations and institutional scandal was deadly for his reputation. One by one, the pillars of his credibility crumbled. Clients no longer saw him as a safe guide. Churches stopped inviting him to speak. Readers began questioning the integrity of his books and programs. Every new accusation chipped away at the careful image he had cultivated for years. And the more he stayed silent, the louder the scandal grew. In the end, what shocked people most wasn't just the behavior itself, but the betrayal. Doug Weiss had built his platform on the promise of healing, honesty, and restoration. People came to him with their deepest wounds, believing he would treat them with care. Instead, many felt they had been manipulated, pressured, or misled. That betrayal of trust was more devastating than any single allegation. It went to the very heart of what his ministry had promised. The scandal surrounding Weiss became a cautionary tale in Christian circles. It wasn't only about one man's fall. It was about what happens when charisma and credentials go unchecked, when a platform becomes bigger than accountability, and when the image of a leader is protected at the expense of the people he is meant to serve. For Doug Weiss, the allegations turned his reputation upside down. For the community that had once celebrated him, they became a painful reminder that not all who speak of healing truly offer it. That is how the rise of a trusted Christian counselor turned into a storm of scandal. The man who once promised hope to the broken was now seen as broken himself, and the community he had influenced was left with the difficult task of deciding what to believe, who to trust, and how to move forward in the face of yet another fall from grace. The impact of Doug Weiss's scandal didn't stop with him. Once his name was tied to Daystar, the fallout rippled through the network and far beyond it, shaking confidence in Christian media and leaving churches and believers around the world asking hard questions. Daystar had already been under fire for years, facing accusations of financial misuse, abuse of power, and silencing those who tried to speak out. When Weiss's controversies became public, they blended with Daystar's ongoing troubles, creating a storm that no one in leadership could ignore. Daystar was once untouchable. It had been founded by Marcus and Joni Lamb in the 1990s and grew into one of the most influential Christian networks in the world. For many families, it was background noise in the living room, sermons, music, interviews, and appeals for donations. The faces on screen became trusted companions, and viewers sent in their money believing they were building something eternal. But when scandals surfaced, private jets bought with donations, funds quietly moved around, voices silenced within the Lamb family, trust began to erode. The controversy around Doug Weiss only made things worse, because it confirmed what many had already begun to suspect. Daystar wasn't living up to the image it had sold for decades. One of the clearest signs of the damage came when major ministries began pulling their shows from Daystar. Names like Joyce Meyer, Jesse Duplantis, and Lance Wallnau had built their own followings, and their programs filled Daystar's schedule. For them to walk away was more than a programming change. It was a statement. It signaled to viewers that something was deeply wrong at the network, and that association with Daystar had become toxic. For a broadcaster that had built its reputation on partnerships with well-known pastors and teachers, this was a devastating blow. Inside the network, the effects were just as harsh. Former employees, including members of the Lamb family itself, spoke about a culture of fear and control. Jonathan and Susie Lamb described being pushed out, demoted, or silenced after raising concerns. Recordings surfaced of leaders equating loyalty to Daystar with loyalty to God, blurring the line between faith and institutional control. For many in the church, this was shocking, but it also felt familiar. Stories of spiritual intimidation and silencing had surfaced in other ministries before, but seeing it play out on such a large stage forced a wider reckoning. The Christian community at large struggled to make sense of it. For years, Daystar had been presented as a beacon of hope and healing. Now, viewers were being asked to face the possibility that the same network had misused funds, covered up misconduct, and empowered leaders who crossed boundaries. For believers who had donated money, who had prayed along with telethons, who had trusted the faces on screen, it felt like betrayal. Some responded with anger, calling Weiss and others wolves in sheep's clothing. Others felt weary, as though yet another scandal had chipped away at their faith in church institutions. The effects went beyond disillusionment. Local pastors found themselves fielding questions from congregants who wanted to know if their donations were safe, if their own church was accountable, if the leaders they trusted were transparent. Small group discussions and online forums lit up with debates. Should Christians continue supporting large media ministries at all? Was it even possible to run something on the scale of Daystar without sliding into corruption? These weren't abstract questions. They were raw and personal, asked by people who had given their last dollars in faith and now wondered if they had been misled. At the same time, the scandal reignited conversations about accountability in Christian leadership. Too often, ministries had been allowed to operate like private kingdoms, insulated from oversight, where leaders could blur the lines between personal and institutional finances. The overlap of Doug Weiss's personal life with Daystar's platform highlighted how dangerous that lack of boundaries could be. When the line between ministry and personal ambition disappears, the people who suffer most are always the donors, the staff, and the vulnerable who trusted the ministry in the first place. For many, the question became bigger than Weiss or Daystar. It was about the culture of celebrity pastors, media empires, and unchecked power in the church. Every new scandal seemed to follow the same pattern. Charisma builds the brand, donations fuel the machine, leaders enjoy the perks, and when abuse or misuse surfaces, silence and cover-ups follow. The fallout from Daystar forced churches to confront whether they were complicit in that cycle by failing to ask hard questions sooner. But even in the wreckage, there was a glimmer of hope. Survivors of abuse, former staff, and disillusioned viewers began speaking out louder than ever before. Social media gave them a platform to share their stories, to warn others, and to demand reform. Calls for transparency grew stronger. Independent audits, clear financial reporting, and safe channels for whistleblowers became rallying cries. Some churches began re-examining their own systems of accountability, recognizing that trust is fragile and once broken, hard to repair. The impact of the scandal is still being felt. For Daystar, its reputation may never recover. For Doug Weiss, the credibility that once made him a household name lies in ruins. But for the wider church, the lessons remain urgent. How will Christian communities respond when leaders fail? Will they continue to protect institutions at all costs, or will they choose courage, humility, and transparency? The ripple effects show that scandals in Christian media are never contained. They touch families, reshape churches, and redefine how believers think about trust and power. Daystar and Doug Weiss may be the names tied to this chapter, but the story is much bigger. It's about whether the church can finally break the cycle of denial and silence, and instead embrace accountability as the foundation of real integrity. Only then can the wider community begin to heal. The road ahead for Doug Weiss and the ministries connected to him is anything but simple. Once a man celebrated for helping people restore broken marriages and overcome deep struggles, he now stands at a crossroads where every move will be judged against the weight of scandal. His voice, once welcomed into living rooms across the country, is now questioned. His programs, once seen as tools for healing, are now shadowed by accusations. The path forward, if there is one, will not be paved with quick fixes or smooth words. It will demand something far harder: truth, transparency, and genuine repentance. For Doug Weiss himself, the first challenge is credibility. Without it, no counseling practice, no book, no seminar can have any impact. The allegations against him, from questionable counseling methods to blurred ethical boundaries, have stripped away the trust he relied on. In the past, his reputation was his strongest currency. People believed him because they saw him as trustworthy. Now that currency is gone. To rebuild it, if he even can, will take more than time. It will take visible steps of accountability, such as allowing independent reviews of his practices and publicly addressing the concerns that have been raised. Silence, which once helped preserve his image, now only deepens suspicion. The same is true for Daystar, the platform that once gave him influence. The network is deeply entangled in its own controversies: financial secrecy, allegations of misuse of funds, and a culture of intimidation. For Daystar, the way forward is also steep. Some ministries have already pulled out, refusing to be associated with the scandal. Viewers, once loyal donors, have walked away, feeling betrayed. The question for Daystar is whether it will choose to protect its image or take the painful path of reform. Reform means opening the books, submitting to audits, creating safe spaces for whistleblowers, and allowing those who have been silenced to finally be heard. Anything less will feel like another cover-up, and the damage to its credibility will remain permanent. But beyond the personal stories of Weiss and Daystar lies the bigger picture: the wider church. Scandals like this don't just affect one man or one ministry. They leave ripples that spread into churches and communities everywhere. Pastors face hard questions from congregants. How do we know our leaders are accountable? How can we trust that donations are being used for ministry and not for personal gain? Why does the same cycle of charismatic leaders, unchecked power, and eventual scandal keep repeating? These are questions that can't be brushed aside with simple answers. They demand a cultural shift in how churches and Christian organizations operate. The road ahead, then, is not just about whether Doug Weiss can return to ministry. It is about whether the Christian community as a whole will take this moment seriously enough to change. It requires building systems of accountability that don't rely on personalities or loyalty, but on transparency and shared responsibility. It means creating spaces where victims and whistleblowers are not silenced or punished, but supported and protected. It means putting integrity above image, even if that means losing viewers, donors, or prestige in the short term. For Weiss personally, redemption is never completely out of reach. Christian teaching makes room for repentance and restoration. But repentance is not just an emotional statement or a tearful interview. It is a process. It requires confession, not excuses. It requires stepping away from power, not clinging to it. It requires making amends to those who were harmed, not ignoring their voices. If Weiss chooses that path, it will not restore him to his former platform overnight, but it could help him regain something more important: integrity. Without that, any attempt to relaunch his ministry will ring hollow, and audiences will see it for what it is: damage control, not transformation. For Daystar, the same principle applies. The network can either double down on protecting its leaders and its brand, or it can acknowledge the pain, open itself up to scrutiny, and choose humility over pride. If it chooses the second path, it may survive with a smaller, humbler platform, but one that can eventually be trusted again. If it chooses the first, the scandals will only multiply and the decline of trust will accelerate. And for the wider church, the road ahead is a test of courage. Will leaders finally be willing to dismantle the systems that allow abuse of power to flourish? Will congregations demand transparency and accountability, even when it is uncomfortable? Or will people fall back into the old pattern: shock, outrage, silence, and then forgetfulness, until the next scandal surfaces? The choice is real, and it will shape how the next generation views the church. The truth is, trust once broken is incredibly hard to rebuild, but it is not impossible. It takes honesty, time, and visible change. For Doug Weiss, for Daystar, and for the Christian community, the future depends on whether they will take that narrow, painful path of accountability, or continue down the wide, easy road of image management and denial. The world is watching, and more importantly, so are the very people who once believed in them. The road ahead is not about protecting reputations, it is about protecting people. If Weiss and Daystar can understand that, there may still be a way forward. Not to the same kind of influence they once held, but to something smaller, truer, and rooted in integrity. If not, their story will become just another example of what happens when leaders choose power over truth. The choice lies before them, and the consequences will echo far beyond their own name.